Heaven is for Real, a little boy's astounding story of his trip to heaven and back. Todd Burpo is the author, also the father of little Colton, who had this experience when he wasn't quite 4 years of age. And we've been having quite a conversation this month, and I know you found it gripping. In the clip we saw yesterday, Todd, Colton describes a number of people who are relatives of his, yes, including his great-grandfather, whom he had never met. And when you got talking about this, as you describe in the book, you showed him this picture of Lawrence Barber, who was your grandfather.
Yes.
Pop was his nickname, at age 61.
And that's the Pop that I knew.
That's the Pop that you knew. You show him this picture and he says, no, that's not him.
No one's old in heaven. No one has glasses. It's all I would get out of him.
Yeah, so you sent away to an aunt who had
my mother.
Your mom, who had some pictures of Pop when he was a young guy. Now here's a picture of him with your grandmother Ellen, Uncle Bill, and Todd's mom Kay. She's the little one there in the middle. He looks at this picture of Pop and says, that's him.
Well, you know, I don't even explain to him what I'm showing to him. I say, hey, Colton. Now this is about 2 years later too.
So you don't tell him this is Pop. You just show him
I just say,
picture.
Hey, Colton, take a look at this. I just hand him a black and white picture of copy of that photograph. And he has no explanation. He doesn't even know what I'm handing to him. I just say, take a look at it. He looks at it and goes, hey, looks up at me, how did you get a picture of Pop like that? Now, explain to me how a Sunday school teacher implanted that memory into him and how the drugs and chemicals made him invent that. And I just looked at him. I said, well, Colton, don't you recognize anyone else in the picture? You see, my grandmother was about 88 years old at the time I showed him that picture, but she was still alive. I didn't expect him to recognize my mother as a baby, but I thought maybe he would recognize her.
Right.
He looks back at it, studies it, looks up and goes, no, I don't know anyone else in this picture. Then I point to my grandmother. I said, well, don't you recognize her? I point her out. He looks at it. I don't know who that is, Daddy. I'm like, well, who was Pop married to, Colton? And he looks back at it. He goes, you mean that's Grandma Ellen? That doesn't look like Grandma Ellen. Now, she was a lot better looking in her 20s than in her 80s. But he could not recognize the living relative, but knew exactly who Pop was.
You mentioned Sunday school teachers implanting drugs and chemicals influencing the brain. These are some of the critics that have
their excuses, yeah,
commented
for dismissing
on this book,
yeah.
Which I'm told, I mentioned it was a 2 million bestseller. It's now up to 6 million bestseller, even on the Canadian newspaper Globe and Mail. Any explanation for this? I mean, why such an interest, do you think? I mean, it's more than church people who are buying the book,
Yes.
obviously.
Well, I think maybe there's two reasons. That's the best I can come up with. First of all, it's coming from a child. There's an innocence from a child that's disarming. It just is. Yeah. And it's simple. I mean, you go to church and sometimes we use words like sanctification, regeneration, justification, and people go, what are you saying? When a little boy says, I came back from heaven, I saw my sister, I saw my grandpa, this is what everyone gets that. This is what Jesus looks like. Everyone understands. Us pastors haven't made anything
So how has this impacted you as a preacher?
It's reminded me that I need to keep it simple.
Right.
It really has.
I always thought the best compliments for my sermons was when the little kids would come and say, great sermon, Pastor.
You're right.
Yeah, I loved it. Heaven is for Real. A little boy's astounding story of his trip to heaven and back. Todd Burpo is the author, and we're making this book available to you this month, and this month alone. Here's how you can get your copy.
Heaven is for Real is the true story of the 4-year-old son of a small-town Nebraska pastor who during emergency surgery slips from consciousness and enters heaven. He survives, and young Colton begins to share how he met his miscarried sister, whom no one had told him about.
And she comes up and gives me a big hug and tells me she's my sister, and then she explains what happened.
Colton continued to describe the horse that only Jesus could ride and how the Holy Spirit sends power from heaven to help us. Heaven is for Real is told by the father, Todd Burpo, but often in Colton's own words. The message is simple: heaven is a real place. Jesus really loves children, and be ready, there is a coming last battle. This book is our thanks to you for your support. To request a copy, write to us in Canada or in the United States. Visit crossroads.ca or simply call 1-800-265-3100.